Hello, Fountain Church. Just glad to be with you again and get to share for a few minutes just what we've heard this week as we gathered together and, Lord willing, how we can work toward applying it together. We heard from Paul this week the offensive, at some level, corrective to no longer make provision for the flesh to gratify its desires, which carries with it the recognition and admission that our flesh and our spirit are at war with one another. And yet so often we don't recognize that battle that goes on over our affections because we've become so used to just kind of floating through our days. We get settled into routines and habits that have formed us and shaped us. And so often we don't realize that we're unaware of this battle raging for our affections. And so it's helpful to hear the Apostle Paul, inspired by the Spirit, remind us that we do, in fact, become guilty of making provision for our flesh, that we do create habits and circumstances in which our sin is allowed to thrive. And it's therefore helpful to fight against that, to work toward giving sin no foothold, no inways, no pathway into our lives, but rather to put on the Lord Jesus Christ. And so how do we do that? That's the million-dollar question. How do we put on Christ? And the answer, I think, is much clearer than we want it to be. So often we take what's plain, we take what's clear, and we make it gray. So when the Lord tells us to put on Jesus Christ, we're to remember that God told us in the letter of 2 Peter that He has given us all that we need for life and godliness. So the first thing that we need to understand is that you don't lack anything in the Scriptures that's necessary for putting on Christ. But secondly, as far as putting on Christ and what that looks like and how it works, I would encourage you to look to Jesus, to see how this perfect God, eternally existent, puts on flesh and dwells among us and becomes humbly dependent upon the power of God in His life. Just read through the Gospels and see how frequently Jesus makes Himself alone, how He comes to His Father and pleads that His Father's will would be done, that God's will would be accomplished. And so when we consider putting on Christ, I would encourage you to look to Christ to see how He lived His life in His flesh, and then go before your Father in heaven boldly with the access that's been granted to you by Jesus and ask Him to give you the Son. It's our belief that He will give it to you. Amen.